Baruch Hashem. Today's daf yomi is Zevachim daf Gimel, Zevachim 3. Baruch Hashem. We'll get started on the bottom of Beis, Bays, 7 lines from the bottom. Today's daf is dedicated for Shmir for Chayalim Atzal for the Shvuyim and a Yeshua for Am Yisrael in the States Torah. The Gemara has just said that when it comes to kachim, when it comes to sacrifices, if you have neutral intent, stama, that's going to be considered like you had the proper intent. But when it comes to a get, when it comes to a divorce document, then we say that neutral intent is insufficient. You need to have affirmative intent to write the get and to give the get for this woman. So the Gemara says, what's the source of this? Gabe get to stama by a divorce. If it was just neutral, if it was just baseline intent, puzzle, we're going to disqualify it. And what's the source for that? The Gemara is going to give 5 suggestions, 5 attempts to prove this. First is Elim and Mehada Tanan. In the following case, over Bashuk, he's walking in the marketplace. The Shama Sofer, and he hears that the scribes who are students are makrin, or they're reading their get, and they say Ish Ploni, Girish Plonis, Malcolm Ploni, such and such a person divorced this person from this place. For Amr, and this guy happens to say Zeshmi v'Zeshem Ishti, this is my name, is my wife's name, Pasol Agarish, but we can't use it to divorce. We see from here that since they just said neutral intent, it's no good. But that's not a proof, because Dilma could Rav Papa. The Gemara rejects that attempt because maybe it's like Rav Papa. The Amar Rav Papa, Halcha Besofrina Asuyim Islamic Askiran. I gave the punchline away in advance, but maybe what we're talking about here is scribes who are learning, they're studying. It wasn't meant for the purpose of a get. It was just meant to teach people how to write, to practice learning how to write a get. And so therefore, that's why it's insufficient. But maybe neutral proof would be okay. Second attempt on the top of Gimel and Aleph. Yes, okay, and we learned, Kasav Agarish at Ishto, let's say a man writes to divorce his wife, the Nimlach, and then he changes his mind, and he has this get already. So now what's he supposed to do with it? Matzo ben Iro, and he said, he finds somebody else in town, and he says, listen, I got the same name as you. Your wife has the same name as my wife. Why don't you take my divorce and give it to her? Pasul Agarish, well, he cannot use it. Why? Because maybe it's because it was neutral intent. And so we see from here maybe that you need affirmative intent. So the Gemara says, no, Dilma, no, that case is different because Shani Asam the Interclay L'Shem Girushin. That's not a case of neutral intent. That's where he specifically wrote it for the purpose of his wife, of the man's first wife. The L'Shem Girushin Dahu was specifically written for the first man to give to his wife, and so therefore was removed from the possibility of the other woman. So a third attempt, yes or okay, and we learned if he has 2 wives, their names are the same. Because of the Garish is a Gadoa. Well, by the way, that's perhaps where he has to divorce one of them, because 2 wives with the same name, you have big problems. But anyway, because of the Garish is a Gadoa. If he writes a document to divorce the older one, well, you Garish he can't use it for the younger one. And so we see from here that neutral intent is insufficient by a get. The Gemara says that's no proof. Same answer. Maybe he specifically was removing the second one from it by writing it for the first one. Yes, so 4th attempt. Yes, okay. Where he says to the scribe, he says, I've got 2 wives. You write it for whichever one you write it for whichever one. And then whichever one I want, I'll divorce. Apostle Garishbo. There, we're going to say it's not capable. He can't use it for a divorce. And so we see from here that just a neutral get is not a sufficient intent. Versus that's also not a proof. No, maybe that case is different. It brings us into the question, the sugya of Brera. Brera is where we have a future event to determine what was really the future event determines the intent of a past event. And so maybe we would say that in the future, by giving it to this person, by giving it to wife number 1, he intended all along to write it for her. We say no, that we don't say Brera. We don't say that the future event can determine the efficacy of the preceding event, of the ancient event. And this really, we don't say that, and therefore this is worse than stama. This is worse than neutral, because maybe at the time that he wrote it, he didn't know specifically which one he wanted to, and so therefore maybe he was uprooting it from the other one. So it's not a case of neutrality, because maybe at the beginning we were not going to say the later event can determine it, and so therefore it's indeterminable who he had in mind for, and so therefore he had uprooted from the other one. So then the Gemara finally concludes this discussion with a fifth attempt. Somebody who's writing a tofes is like a template of a get. He has to leave a space for a man and space for the woman. It's place for the witnesses. It's place for the time. You have to leave that space. Behold, you are permitted for every single person. And that's, Rashi says, the ikar of the get. The main form of the get, the main part of the get. We see from here, stama is possible. We see from here that neutrality by a get is not okay, even though it was written for the purpose of a get. It was not written for the purpose of this woman, and so therefore it's not going to be a valid get. So now we're at the two dots in the middle of 3a, and the Gemara has said in yesterday's daf, the Gemara suggested that there was a Ravina said to Rav Papa that you missed the discussion that Rava had in the base medrash yesterday, and he took two contradictory things between intent by kachim and intent by get, and he threw them against each other. So now he says surami milsa achrisa. There was another sugya. Remember I said yesterday that I think there's like a psicha to the whole tract. And he says, yeah, Rava raised another question in his tract. He raised another question. What is it? Surami milsa achrisa. What's the other thing he raised? Miyam Rav Yehuda Marav Chata Sheshachta L'Shem Oa Psula Shachta L'Shem Chulin Kashira. He said, did Rav really say this thing? We learned in our Mishnah that if you slaughter the chatas for the purpose of an oa, it's disqualified. That was one of the positions in the Mishnah. But Rava went a step further. He says, okay, if you slaughter for an oa, it's the sin offering for an oa, it's disqualified. But shachta l'shem chulin. But if you took the sin offering and you slaughtered it for the purpose of chulin is like non-sacred meat. Just like, let's say, you want to grill meat in your, for your company coming over to your house for, a Sunday night dinner. Well, that is going to be kosher. Ironically, the chatas for the purpose of an ola is no good. But if you took the chatas intent and you slaughtered it for a chulin, then it's still a chatas and it's kshera. We see from here a very powerful concept. Only something that's close, the mina, if it's of the same nature, that could ruin it. But if it's the lav mina, well, machriba. This is like an expression that Rabbi Weiss once told me: your enemies can't hurt you, only your friends. Only your friends can hurt you. So the mina machriba, if it's from the same nature, that could ruin it. But meaning to say, if you went from a chatas for an ola, that could ruin it. But from a chatas to a chulin, that can't ruin it. Veramini, is that really the case? Do we really agree with this idea that only mina machriba, the mina or machriba? Don't we say kol get nichtav shelo l'shem isha is possible? Don't we have a concept that any get that was written not for the right woman is disqualified? If you write this get for a non-Jewish woman, it's not going to be kosher. It's possible. It's disqualified. But why? She's lav mina. So why can it ruin it? So why, if you write the get for the idolatry, for the non-Jewish woman, is it disqualified? She's not lav mina. It shouldn't be able to ruin it. So the Gemara answers, Vishani, and Rava answered this question. He says, get, if you take the get and you say, okay, get rid of this non-Jewish woman from the concept, then avile stama, then it just becomes neutrality. The stama is possible, and then by a get, we just established that neutrality is disqualified. But by a kachim, dal chulin, if you get rid of the chulin, avile stama, it's neutrality. And stomach sherim, and the neutral intent is kosher, and that's why by a korban it's okay, but not by a get. Rama milsach risa. Now Rava threw another contradiction, and this one's a little technical. Some technical laws about tumah and tahara, so it might be a little tricky, but we'll do the best we can. Rama milsach risa. Miyam Rav Yehuda Marav chatas shachto shem ola psula shachto shem chulin kshera. Alma demina machriva delomina lemachriva. Do we really say this concept? That only something that's of the same nature can ruin it, but something that's not of the same nature cannot ruin it. But then we were in the Brisa. So this is based upon a pasuk that teaches us a law about what is metame, what causes ritual impurity by what's called a klicheres. It says in the verse, kol klicheres, any earthenware utensil, imagine a clay oven, yipol mayam asher yipol mayam el tocho. Now let's say a dead rat, a sheretz, falls into the oven, kol asher b'sochel yitma, that anything in that oven, any of the food items in that oven, if there's something that falls into the airspace of the oven, and then there's an egg in that oven is going to become tamei. So that's the pasuk. Tanya tocho, v'lo toch tocho. But let's say there's a utensil in that oven. So there's the oven, and then you have a pottery utensil whose opening extends beyond the oven, and there's a food item in that pottery utensil inside the oven. Then that will not become tamei. That food item is saved. And even if it wasn't pottery utensil, but let's say it's a metal utensil or a wood utensil, something that typically goes in the mikvah, matzah, it also saves the food item. So what's the concept here? A metal utensil can become tamei by touching from the outside, unlike a pottery utensil. But we see from here that even though the kli shetef is a totally different type of utensil, we're saying that it's still able to stop it. So it's going to be something that is able to be machriva, that it could stop the tumah. And we're saying that even though it's not in the same nature as the klicheretz, it's machriva. So the Gemara says, isn't that a question? Vishani, and Rava answered, Asu chulin eitzal no, you're making the wrong distinction. Chulin and kachim are two separate things, and those two separate things, in this case, the parallel is not to a pottery utensil and an earthenware utensil, but it's between a utensil versus a partition. A utensil is the same thing as the first utensil, and therefore that's why the kli shetef is able to stop the tumah. But if it would be a partition, then it wouldn't be able to stop it, because then it'll be two separate things. So that's what we're saying. Just like if you have a partition with the oven, then it wouldn't stop the tumah, and what was on the other side of the partition would become tamei. So too the chulin by kachim, it doesn't help it at all, and therefore it doesn't make any difference. It's no impact, and therefore, if you have the chatas for the chulin, it's going to still be kosher. The Tanan, and now we prove this idea from the Mishnah and Kalim. Let's say you have the Tanor Shachatzitzu ben Esarim Obiyarios. Let's say you have an oven, a clay oven, and you use some wooden boards or some curtains as a partition. And then you have this dead rodent in the other side of the oven. The partition doesn't stop anything. Akol tamei, everything is tamei because it's a different item. It's a partition as opposed to utensil, and so the tumah doesn't stop the tumah. But if it would be kaveres, let's say I have a basket, sheipechusa upekuka bekash. Let's say I have a basket which has an opening, or if it's plugged up with straw, mishuleshes lavir tanir, and then it's suspended into the oven. Sheretz shebetocha tanor, and you have the sheretz in the oven, then tamei. Sheretz betocha hatanor tamei, and you have a sheretz inside the basket, then the oven will be tamei. Sheretz betanor, and let's say you have a sheretz in the oven, ochon shebetocha, then the food in the basket are tamein, and that's basically the same application of that law. Rabbi Eliezer Mataya. Rabbi Eliezer, however, says under those circumstances that it will be the food items will be tahor on the other side of the mechitza, and we'll see why he says that. And I'm a Rabbi Eliezer says, what's the reason why I say if there's a partition, the food items on the other side of the partition are tahor? Kal v'chomer, because I'll give you a proof from logic. Im hitzio b'meis, if this partition is able to stop the tumah of a dead body, and that's chamor, that's more severe than a sheretz. For sure, it can stop with a pottery utensil, which is not as severe a level of tumah as a dead body. And Amar Lo, the Rabbanan responded to Rabbi Eliezer, whoa, on top of 3b, imitzio b'meis hachamor. The reason why it saves by dead body is Shekin Chaluka all in, because people typically divide up a tent with partitions, and so therefore, whatever on one side of the partition is considered like a different tent, and therefore it's not going to become tame from the dead body. But that's not how you typically divide up an oven. Even though it's even though the pottery utensil is less severe tumah, that's not the typical way in which it's divided, and so therefore the partition doesn't work. And so the Gemara says, okay, fine. So we saw that this teaching of Rav, it was not challenged by the Rabbanan, because the Rabbanan were saying that there's a big difference between a partition versus a metal utensil. Hatenach Rabbanan. So the Rabbanan draw that distinction and they say the partition doesn't stop the tumah, but according to Rabbi Eliezer, it says the partition stops the tumah, even though it's a totally different thing than the pottery utensil. Well, Rabbi Eliezer, Rav is contradicting the position of Rabbi Eliezer. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Eliezer chavachomer kama. Rabbi Eliezer has a logical, no, Rabbi Eliezer says kavachomer, that if it saves by the dead body, which is more severe, for sure it should save by the klicharis. And the only reason why is because of this kavachomer. But by karchim, he'll admit that since it's enomino lo machraba, meaning in this case, by the case of the tumah, he says the kavachomer. But in general, by kachim, he wouldn't say that. Well, by kachim also we could have a kavachomer, according to Rebbe Eliezer. Kachim, mechal, and kachim. If the chatas will be metame, or the wrong intent will make the kachim no good, chulin will kol shekain. For sure, it should make the chulin no good. So therefore, ela taima derav. So the reason why Rav says that a chatos that was slaughtered for chulin is going to be okay is not because of this logic. It's not based upon the svara of mina machriv shalom mina lo machriv, but it's based upon a pasuk that was taught by the Amora Rebbe Elazar, Rebbe Elazar. Even though Rav came before him, just it's the same logic. The Amar Rebbe Elazar, my time of the Rav, that Rebbe Elazar says, what's the Rav's explanation? Because it says, as Patshe b'nei Yisrael es asher yarimu Hashem. It says they should not desecrate the Kodesh b'nei Yisrael that should be brought to Hashem. Kodshim mechal and kodshim. We learn from that pasuk that only if you have the wrong intent by kodshim can it disqualify kodshim. Then chulin mechal and kodshim. But if you have the wrong intent about a chulin, it cannot disqualify the kodshim. So it's based upon a pasuk. It's not based upon that logic. Even though we like that logic, it's not the source. So we see from here that the pasuk that Rebbe Elazar cites in the name of Rav overrides the kavachomer. That if kodshim is mechal and kodshim, and for sure can mechal and chulin. We see that this pasuk overrides it. So why don't we do this gzeres hakosav also and say that the tocho that even though we can learn from a kavachomer that, like what Rebbe Eliezer was trying to say, that mechitza should save from a tumah. Nevertheless, the word tocho should override it and say that everything is tameh, even if it's on the other side of the mechitza. So the Gemara says, no, he can't use it. Rabbi Eliezer doesn't want to use that gzeres hakosav. He needs it for another case, which is if you have food items that are surrounded by clay, you, whatever reason, you have food which you put clay on top of it, and then you stick that in the oven, and then it's going to become tameh, even though it's surrounded by clay on top of the food. You might have thought that since if the dead rodent touched this clay that was surrounding the food, it wouldn't become tameh. Also in the airspace, it wouldn't. So we say by tocho it does. Rabbanan don't use the word tocho for that, because they don't need a pasuk for that, because they say it's obviously the case that it would be tameh. And so therefore tocho is extra for the rabbis to teach us about a kli shetef, that it is also going to save the food item from tumah. If Yosef Rami Shinoi Kodesh or Shinoi Baum. So now we have a separate question. We have Shinoi Kodesh. What's Shinoi Kodesh? That's if you change it from Chatos to Chulin or Chatos to Ola. You change it from one kachim to a different one. And then there's a different idea where you change the owner. You haven't taught Ruvain was the one who brought the animal, and the person designated it to Kohen had in mind to bring it for Shimon. So he raises the question that he raised the question. He said, Mi amarav, and then he answered Mishani, Mi amarav chatas shachto Hashem chatas kasher. Does Rav really say that if you have a chatas that you slaughter for the purpose of a chatas, that it's kashera, but Hashem oa psua? But if you do it for an oa, it's disqualified. Alma delav mina machriba. That we see from here that if it's not from the same alma the lav mina machriva, we see from here that if you brought it for a different korban, here lav mina doesn't mean what we meant on the Amud Aleph. On Amud Aleph, when we said lav mina, meant from kachim to chulin, but kachim to kachim was mina. But here we're saying chatas to ola is lav mina. So we see that lav mina is machriva, it ruins it. The mina, but if it would be for a different chatas, meaning to say chatas for one sin, but you intended it to bring it for initially a chatos for your sin of eating blood, and now you're bringing it for the sin of eating chalev, that would be kosher, demina machriva. But alma de la mina machriva, demina lo machriva. But if it's for the same type, for the same chatos, but for different sin, it does not ruin it. Does Rav really say that? But Amar Rav chatas shachta al misha mechuyev chatas. Rav says that let's say you took a chatas and you slaughtered it not for the same person who it was intended to be brought, but somebody else who also needed a chatas. That's going to be disqualified because you changed the owner there. But al misha mechuyev ola. But if you slaughtered the chatas to serve as an atonement for somebody who requires to bring an ola, then it will be kosher. Alma. We see from here the bar mine machriba, that if it's of the same nature, it ruins it. The lav bar mine, but since he tried it for an ola and it's different, well, machriba, it doesn't ruin it. Meshani, and we answer hasam v'shachat osel chatasam rachmana. No, and the answer is that by shinoi kachim, what's the source for the prohibition? It's because he says he has to slaughter it for a chatas, says the Torah. For a chatas l'shem chatas nishchata, that if you slaughter for a chatas, that's okay. But a hacha v'chiper alav stiv alav v'lo chavero, that the chatas can only be brought for the person himself and not for a different person. The sin offering has to be brought for the person. You can't atone for one sin person for a different sin, and therefore chavera dumyu didei shemechuyev kapara kamosa, and so therefore it only works for somebody that is like him, but for somebody that is not mechuyev kapar kamoso, it's not going to disqualify it. Rav Chaviva, another similar question. Rav Chaviva Rami Shinoi Balam Atoch Tocho. Oh, we bring it all together here. Rav Chaviva raised the question from the din of Shinoi Balam. Remember, if you changed it from one chatas to another chatas, it's no good. But from a chatas to an ola, it's so good. Meaning, say from one owner to another person by chatas, it's no good. But by one person to another person and a chatas to an ola would be good. So he raises this question and he answers. Does Rav really say this? Halacha chatas that was brought for somebody who's mechuyev chatas disqualified, somebody who's mechuyev an ola is kshera. Alma demina machriva, delamina lo machriva. That if it's of a different nature, it doesn't ruin it. Vatanya tocho vo toch tocho. But we learned that if the sheretz falls into the airspace of the oven, it makes the food tamei, but not into a utensil inside the oven. And even if the utensil is a metal utensil, that'll be matzil. That'll save it. So what's the problem here? So we say that even though the kli shetef is not a pottery utensil like the oven, nevertheless, it draws a chatzitza between the oven and the food. And not like Rav that says, that if it's not of that kind, it doesn't stop it. And here we're saying it does stop it, even though it's not of that kind. So we say Mishani Arba Tocho Ksiv Toch Tocho Toch Tocho. And so he says it's based upon a Xeris Hakata. Like we said earlier, Chadal Gufe, Chadal Xeris Shava. One is to teach us the law of Kli Charis is Metame from the airspace. One is the Xeris Shava. Just like to teach us, just like a utensil makes the food tummy from the airspace, so too through a sheretz without touching it. One is to teach us that only a kli charis becomes tummy from the airspace, but a kli shetef does not. V'idach and that's the idea that even the kli shetef saves it. Okay, we'll stop here. I know this last part, this stuff you need to go over a couple of times to get solid, but it's all when you go over it a couple of times, you'll see it's all completely logical. Okay, we'll stop here. Shkoyach.
Thank you.